Thanks so much. I'm really, as an art historian and someone who's especially committed to thinking about overlooked histories of art and visual culture, and especially ones that have been overlooked because of the ways in which the artist or the subject matter was understood as different or deviant in a sexual register. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity, that we have this opportunity together to revisit in a different light. And I think actually one of the things that art history is getting better at, but still has a ways to go, is understanding that the history of art is not only the history of artists and of art objects, but also of exhibitions. And that exhibitions need to be written into our accounts of the past, and also, as I hope we'll do tonight, revisited and revived in certain ways later, after they're over, and not just through the catalogs. Okay, we have gathered tonight to revisit the 1995 exhibition In a Different Light, Visual Culture, Sexual Identity, Queer Practice. One of the earliest, and in my estimation, still one of the most influential and imaginative museum exhibitions of queer art and cultural sensibility. Could we go to the first? Oh, rather than looking at my name, yeah. So I'm just showing two installation shots from that exhibit. Before turning things over to our panel, I want to highlight a few aspects of what made this show and the accompanying catalog so special. The first is the way the curators, Nayland Blake and Larry Rinder, avoided easy binaries of gender, male-female, sexuality, gay-straight, and history, past-present, with the past unfolding as though organically in chronological sequence. So their works were mixed. There was no sequencing according to the date of the artwork or the date of the artist's birth or death. Instead, as Larry will talk about in more detail, the art was presented in categories ranging from void, self, and couple to orgy, world, and utopia, with, of course, orgy being my personal favorite. But I'm showing you couple, an installation shot of couple on the left and other on the right. And I'll just point out that that's on the center of the wall is a joint project by Richard Prince and Cindy Sherman, where they photographed each other, both impersonating this kind of androgynous figure in a dark suit and a red page boy wig. That's actually right next to it, an amazing cover of an early gay liberation newspaper called Gay Power, the very first issue from 1969, just after Stonewall. And then on the right, you're seeing a Donald Moffat piece, that light board on the left, far left, and in the middle, the painting is actually by Pavel Chelychev from the 30s, and then on the far right is a Romaine Brooks. There's a Patti Smith, portrait of Patti Smith by Robert Mapplethorpe to the right, and then at the far right is an incredible painting by Romaine Brooks called Peter, Portrait of a Young English Girl. The second thing, I don't want to, as I say, I don't want to dwell on this because it was Larry's and Nayland's thing. I mean, they came up with their idea, not thing. And so Larry should talk about it. But I just remember how engaged and imaginative I thought it was, and how it made me rethink the ways I was looking at art. So for example, actually Cary Leibowitz's work, which was, well, it was in two places, but the place I remember it most is in Orgy, because Orgy was understood not just in a sexual sense, but as the catalog said, as works that explore the pleasures of connection, of excess, of overflowing boundaries. And so there was this vitrine of all these different multiples by Cary Leibowitz. And the excess of the work, both materially and in terms of its kind of humor and self-loathing as humor, or humor as self-loathing, that was the kind of visual orgy that you were engaging in. So I just wanted to, this is a shot of family on the left, and you're seeing both drag on the left of the right slide. That side, the left side of that slide is given over to drag. You see some Christopher Mako's portraits of Andy Warhol, a Deb Cass Jewish Jackie series, a silk screen of Barbara Streisand in the guise of a Warhol painting. And then on the right is it Self, Larry? Is that right? Yes, and that's a Kathy Opie painting. Actually, but my favorite thing in this, or one of my favorite things in this particular image is that's a Robert Gober piece that Larry was just telling me about on the far wall that looks like it's plywood, but it's actually not made out of plywood at all. So it's a kind of material drag. And again, this sort of demonstrates, I think, how expansive these categories were allowed the curators to be, or rather, one might say, how expansively they conceived of the categories, so that both abstract and figurative works could reside within these categories, and also a kind of literal imagining of categories like self and family, and a kind of camp or alternative imagining. Okay. The second thing I want to underscore about the show is the way it understood queer, unlike gay and lesbian, as a relational category rather than an identity, and not least as a way of looking that relied as much on the viewer's sensibility as on the artist. So for example, the Robert Morris Leather and Chains poster, I don't think it's illustrated here, but from 1974, some of you may know it, Larry may show it, which strongly resonated, however consciously or unwittingly, with the codes of gay manliness and leather sex, or Richard Prince and Cindy Sherman half cross-dressing so as to become androgynous twins. These were works by artists who were not gay or lesbian identified, but that hardly meant, as their curatorial inclusion in the show made clear, that their work could not be queer or draw on practices of drag, leather, or eroticized theatricality pioneered by sexual minorities. In other words, this was not a show of gay and lesbian artists. It was a show about queer objects and the ways in which art itself might help us to queer the world. Finally, as we remember In a Different Light more than 20 years later, I want to mention how much the show itself remembered and reclaimed queer history, in part by including works from the early 20th century, a Romaine Brooks portrait that you saw, Charles from 1923, or Charles Demuth's Sailors Urinating from 1930, which, anyway, I think Larry's going to show Sailors Urinating, but it was included in the family section of the show, which I kind of love. That unfortunately was not my family, but maybe somebody's. But also in the brilliant catalog to the exhibition by tracing a genealogy of queer art from Marcel Duchamp to Fluxus, feminism, punk, and finally to the explosion of rage, grief, and activism fueled by the early years of the AIDS crisis. In a generous, archivally important gesture, the catalog included a dossier of extended statements by the curators of previous lesbian, gay, and queer exhibitions that had laid the foundation for Rinder and Blake's show. And those previous exhibitions and statements ranged from Harmony Hammond's A Lesbian Show in 1978 to Nicola Tyson's Project Space Trial Balloon, which opened in 1991. In these and other ways, In a Different Light demonstrated that queerness not only insists on the pleasures and powers of non-normative sexuality, but also on the pleasures and powers of the past, as it is revived, reanimated, and remade in the present. So now I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who will be Larry, and then I'm going to come back briefly before Scott and Margaret speak in order to give their introductions. Larry Rinder is director of the University of California, Berkeley Art Museum. I should have said that's where the show was, and so Larry was curator at the time, and now has come back, or has now been back as director for several years. He has held positions at the Museum of Modern Art, the Walker Art Center, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, where he was chief curator of the 2002 biennial. He was the founding director of the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts at California College of the Arts here in San Francisco, where he also served as dean. Please join me in welcoming Larry Rinder.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here. Wonderful to revisit this exhibition so many years later. One minor detail for those art historians in the room, the show title was in a different light. Only the catalog had the subtitle. Nayland in particular wanted to avoid having anything specifically identifying the show as queer, gay, lesbian in the show's title itself, but anyway. Okay, so I can advance my own, I guess, here. Yeah, there we go. That's where it happened. And I, of all people, got the name of my museum wrong. It's actually Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. I'm always having to correct my trustees. So it's wonderful that Scott is here to talk about Kiki and that environment, because that world was really the inspiration for the exhibition. Kiki was a gallery in San Francisco, and it was really the sort of the center of a world of incredible activity and creative fervor and excitement in San Francisco in the early 1990s. I was a very young curator, had just come from New York in 1988 to San Francisco, and getting a sense of the incredible creativity and cross-disciplinary practice going on around Kiki made me feel very excited that I had arrived in a place that had just as much artistic energy and originality as anything I'd left behind in New York. So I wanted, when I saw what was going on in that community, I went to the director of the museum at the Berkeley Art Museum, Pacific Film Archive, then called the University Art Museum, and said, I'd like to do a show that documents this scene in San Francisco, which I think is very exciting. I think it's worth representing in the museum. It's current, but it's museum worthy, so can I do a show? And it happens to be like a queer community, which sounds fine to say now, but back in the day, that was not so usual to do a major museum show about queer art. And Jackie Bass, who I'd already gone through a couple shows with her that pushed the limits a bit, starting with the Robert Mapplethorpe Perfect Moment show, then going on to the Group Material AIDS Timeline. She was familiar with my shenanigans. She said, okay, that sounds fine. And so I said, okay, good. So I went to Nayland Blake, who was a friend and part of this community, and I mentioned the idea to him, and he thought it was a terrible idea. So I said, oh gosh, Nayland, I think you're so cool. Why don't you like my idea? And he's like, well, for one thing, it's all going on just fine without you. What maybe, could you do anything different? Can you add something to the conversation instead of just capturing it and presenting it to your people? And I'm like, that sounds like a good idea. Like what? And so he said, well, you're a museum, you have money, you have space, you have clout, you can get objects from other museums. How about doing a show that contextualizes this work historically? That is something that Kiki can't do. Kiki can't send a loan form to the National Gallery and request their, Romaine Brooks or Charles Demuth or whatever. And he said, while there have been at least half a dozen shows looking at gay and lesbian art, since 1978, Harmony Hammond show, none of them have really put that work in historical context. So there's something right there that you could do. So I said, that sounds like a fantastic idea. Why don't you do it with me? And so he agreed, and we went on to put together the show. And as we began to work on it, some of the basic principles of the show came clear, the first of which being that this was not, as Richard said, going to be a show of self-identified gay and lesbian artists, but rather a show about what we could now call queer objects. I'm not sure we used that term back then. So we were very much open to including work by artists who identified as straight or whatever, or didn't identify as anything. We were really looking at objects. And Nayland proposed a methodology for organizing the show. And I remember he used the model, he suggested of a kind of a surrealist game. He said we should allow the objects to come into our mind as if subconsciously, to let them rest in our minds and converse with each other. Now, perhaps he didn't say it exactly like that, but that's basically what he said. And we would do this alone and together. And I think he actually said it should be like listening into a conversation. And we should capture the most interesting conversations. So when you get a group of objects that are saying something interesting to each other, write that down, note those works, and that will be maybe the beginning of something. Because when we first started working on the show, I think my first comment was, well, so what does this all mean? You know, what is happening? Let's have our thesis. And so he said, no, it has to start with the art. Let's let the art tell us what's going on. That was an incredibly important lesson for me and one I carry with me to this day. Anyway, so we had a lot of fun working on these groupings, and we would come up with them on our own and then share them and find out we had overlaps and compare notes. And then finally, we ended up where we had about 9 or 10 groups of works, and another thing that we did early on was allow ourselves to extend outside of fine art per se and into popular culture, album covers, and things of that kind. So there was a lot of material to choose from. And then after we had our 9 or 10 groups, we looked at them and thought about them and realized that there was a kind of a shape that was beginning to suggest itself that went from a kind of a zero limit situation, which the group that ultimately came to be called void, of blankness or emptiness, of zero condition, to a sort of singularity, to a condition of couple, to a multiplicity, and then to a kind of apotheosis. And that ultimately resolved into this sequence of groupings that really have a kind of numerical progression, but which we ultimately came to interpret in sort of sociological terms as void, self, other, and drag was in there, couple, family, and so on. So the exhibition, as it says in the catalog, doesn't have so much of a aesthetic sensibility as a social sensibility. It's really constructed in a way to represent and this is all, again, after the fact, sort of allowing the groups to sort of suggest this. It represents a kind of a passage of an individual and of a community or a society from a position of sort of self-denial and apartness to growing self-recognition, collectivity, and perhaps ultimately disappearance. Now, part of this, so this image here, Sick Joke, this is a Kiki artifact, and that title, Sick Joke, which maybe Scott will get into a little bit, is really emblematic of, I think, the sensibility of Kiki and much of the art in San Francisco at the time, which was a combination of a kind of a frustrated, depressed, horrified negativity mixed with a manic humor. How this happened, I don't know, but it did. And I think Cary Leibowitz's work really is very much in sympathy with this. And you have to remember that this was really at the height of the AIDS epidemic. It was such a dark, dark time. People were dying a lot, and for this kind of work to come up, the time that ACT UP was being so militant, and it was just hard to get through a day, and to have art that was celebratory, that was joyful in a way, in a sick way, but nevertheless joyful, was really very fresh. So just an homage to Kiki. This is Nayland, and you can see that he fits right in with the sick joke theme. This is him in his bunny costume. Those of you who have not met Nayland, look him up on YouTube. He's really an incredible person. I wish he could be here tonight. And this is the museum. And the museum, showing a shot of the former Berkeley Art Museum, is important because really the architecture of the museum, which was a double helix spiral, and most of the galleries spread out like a fan in a spiral that went upwards, really had a major role in determining the shape of the exhibition, because it forced a kind of linearity, and it suggested a kind of a sort of progression into this sort of ethereal space of transcendence. There's something about sort of going up, up, up into the skylights. So the architecture of the building was definitely a component of the exhibition. So I'm going to run through the sections really quickly. I know we want to move on to the conversation, but anyway, Void. It began with John Cage. The score for John Cage is 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which of course has nothing in it. On the right, Andy Warhol's Portrait of Liz, then Ross Bleckner, and then, of course, this is going to happen a lot today. I'm going to forget people's names. If anybody remembers the name of this artist, Michael. Anyway, the section's called Void, so it's okay. Peter Hujar. Michael Jenkins, Peter Hujar, Candy Darling on her deathbed. This section did have a little bit of a morbid overtone. It was both a beginning, a before existence, but also a kind of after existence. This was a wonderful wall that Rex Ray did, the kind of underlying wallpaper, and then on top of it was a Judy Chicago drawing, Zoe Leonard photograph, David Wojnarowicz, Peter Nagy, and Richard Hell and the Voidoids album cover. This is the Wojnarowicz piece called Fever from 1989. Then Self, Man Ray, Portrait of Isidore Ducasse, Nancy Grossman, wonderful Robert Mapplethorpe, Kathy Opie, Laura Aguilar, thank you, wonderful artist from Los Angeles. The drag, as Richard said, this was drag both as we understand it in terms of cross-dressing, also gender, challenging gender identity, and also kind of what we might think of as object drag, so the piece of plywood, for example. This fantastic piece by Nan Golden, David at Grove Street from 1972. This is the Robert Morris poster, and if he didn't know this was a gay reference, I don't know. Wonderful piece by Vito Acconci, where he sort of tried to, or performed as if he didn't have male genitals, and it was called Conversion. She performed as if she did. The Christopher Makos photographs of Andy Warhol. And then another kind of object drag, the Deborah Cass takeoff on Andy Warhol's Marilyn with Barbra Streisand. This would be a great show for the Jewish Museum. So this was really about desire, the wonderful Zoe Leonard runway shot, the great album cover from Sticky Fingers, Rolling Stones, various other things on the wall. Scott has talked about that. This is the great Romaine Brooks painting. Wonderful early 20th century American artist. If you don't know about Romaine Brooks, look her up. Fantastic painter, sort of like Whistler of lesbianism or something like that. This is Robert Indiana, takeoff on the great Marsden Hartley portrait of the German officer. Millie Wilson, wonderful artist from Los Angeles. Then Couple, great Cary Leibowitz. I can't do that. I can't do this. Kipper Kids. Jasper Johns. So, back in those days, it was a little bit controversial to do things about queer stuff, and so we went to the trouble of contacting every artist who we wanted to include in the show to sort of ask permission, let them know what we were doing. And Jasper Johns didn't respond, and I took that as a yes. Diane Arbus. Then Family. Great general idea piece, wonderful piece. Jack Smith, we had a copy of The Beautiful Book. McDermott and McGuff, is that right? I think so, yes. Recuperating Gay Slurs. And then, of course, throughout the show, there was all kinds of great ephemera, early, in this case, early queer zines. The orgy section, I think more work by Cary Leibowitz, maybe the only artist who is in more than one section. Fantastic things. Larry Pittman, Keith Haring. Some of these, like this one, is actually not the work that was in the show, but we didn't have very good documentation, so I just grabbed things off the internet. Alan Serrett, T. Corinne, and this is the great Charles Demuth, Soldiers Urinating. Charles Demuth, you know anything about Charles Demuth, like grain silos, right? Maybe flower paintings, but this is the real Charles Demuth right here. Carolee Schneemann, a fantastic pornographic piece. And I'm not sure if this is the one where she makes out with her cat, but it might be. World. So this is where we kind of get into the agitprop material, Barbara Kruger. just lots of buttons and posters and zines and things, all the things that were all over the street at that time. Grand Fury, this was a bus poster that you'd see on buses around town. More work of theirs. Jenny Holzer. This is, of course, the Robert Indiana love emblem, and then the general idea. They did some fake stamps, United States stamps, where they transposed the love to read AIDS. And then Utopia. This was kind of a strange section. I'm still not sure I quite understand it, but it had Tony Fair, wonderful piece of Tony Fair, little jars with little things in them. Kathy Opie's Freeway series, and a wonderful Joseph Cornell sand clock that we actually have in our collection. So that's it for my presentation, but of course I'll talk more when we're doing the panel. Thank you very much.
Scott Hewicker is an artist, writer, and musician based in San Francisco. He received his MFA from Stanford and has exhibited his work at Second Floor Projects, Gallery 16, NIAD, Jack Hanley Gallery, Deitch Projects. I'm just reading a selection of these. Gallery Christina Wilson in Copenhagen, the ICA Philadelphia, and the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. He co-curated the exhibit Hauntology at the Berkeley Art Museum with Larry Rinder in 2010 and has played in the bands The Alps, Troll, and Aeromiked. With Cliff Hengst, Hewicker co-edited and illustrated the book Good Times, Bad Trips, published by Gallery 16 Editions in 2007. He has been a contributing columnist for Open Space, the SF MoMA blog, and written hundreds of music reviews for Aquarius Records. He teaches currently at California College of the Arts, and I should just mention he was also an artist who exhibited quite memorably, as you'll see, in a different light. Please welcome Scott.
Thank you, Richard. So thank you for having me here to the Jewish Museum and to Gravity and Lindsay and everybody. So I'm going to talk about Kiki and the queer mission art scene in the early 90s. Can everybody hear me? All right. So all remembered histories are largely one-sided and woefully incomplete. That shouldn't take away the collective magic and possibility felt at the time. I'll start with the In a Different Light show and work my way back. Nayland, in his catalog essay, said that the show was conceived around the energy and activity about a group of community of artists. Not so much about history being made, but lives being lived. I'd like to talk about those lives for a bit, as it was such an exciting time to be here. This is my piece that was in the show. This was in the Self group, and it's called Someday He'll Make It Plain to Me. And that was titled from a Presbyterian hymn. That's the faith that I grew up with. I feel funny talking about the show since I was really young, and I was very new to San Francisco and the art scene, and I was just starting to grasp a sense of what I wanted to do with my own work. But the show was incredibly brilliant and very thoughtful and had amazing work from so many artists, a lot of friends, but artists I respected of different generations and different orientations grouped together, and they had these compelling conversations with each other. At the time, I was making these soft sculptures that were sort of passive-aggressive, if you will, subtly annoying in the way, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice until you stepped on it. A quiet invitation to abuse or ignore. It was constantly getting knocked over. A friend relayed a story about touching Arch Connolly's pearl-encrusted self-portrait nearby, and the guard said, "You couldn't touch anything in the room except that." And he pointed to my piece. "You can kick that all you want." But this was a high point in my life. That was a culmination of a crazy creative period that was largely centered around my friend Rick Jacobson and his gallery Kiki. That was the catalyst of a vibrant art scene of artists, writers, and performers, and in a short run of 18 months, from the summer of '93 to winter of '95, created a chain reaction in the developing art scene, not only in the mission school, but beyond. I worked at the gallery for the last half of 1994 doing gallery sitting and video documentation. But this gallery and scene didn't just happen out of nothing. Other energies were afoot. This act of protest at the 6th International Conference on AIDS had just happened when I moved here in 1990 to attend the Art Institute. City in crisis, Loma Prieta earthquake, shitty economy, corrupt mayors, and AIDS. Not much has changed. Yet because of it, there were many artists sensing the urgency, pain, and rage and tried to make it beautiful in its ugliness or highlight the ugliness in the fake beauty. Artists began to combine art and activism in more visible, ready-made, and easily distributable forms that combine politics, camp humor, and poetics. This is from a piece that was in a Different Light show by Marlene McCarty of Grand Fury called Crossfire that I still have in my kitchen. Through my boyfriend, now husband, Cliff Hengst, and active meetings and fundraising auctions we helped organize, I met Rick Jacobson, Vince Ficteau, Connell Ray Little, Nayland Blake, and Rex Ray. Here's a Queer Nation sticker. Across town at City Lights tonight, I just want to acknowledge that Kevin Killian and Dodie Bellamy are celebrating the book about another rich Bay Area art history that peaked at the same time. The new narrative writers who combine memoir, theory, appropriation, and fiction in inventive new ways were an essential part of this queer scene. Kevin and Dodie were central to a wide cross-section of artists and poets and writers at the time, including Kathy Acker, who taught at the Art Institute, and Robert Gluck, who taught at San Francisco State. Brett Reichman, who's the detail of this painting, who's on the cover, was both an artist in a Different Light show and also showed at Kiki as well. And then at the At a Different Light bookstore, which the exhibition was named after, I believe, artist and writer Daryl Alvarez programmed an amazing performance and reading series, which featured Dennis Cooper, Justin Chin, Nat Bustamante, David E. Johnston, Jennifer Locke, Cliff Hengst, Pomo Afro Homo, and Daryl's performance group, Absolute Man Pussy. This is Daryl here at Jim Winter's opening with Mark Ewart, who was Pansy Division cover model and writer at the time. Mark actually lived in Kiki in the gallery in a really hidden loft in the back for about a year. And of course, there were these three comedy queens: Jerome Kaya, Justin Vivian Bond, and Rodney O'Neill Austin. Living theater 24/7. There were also exciting group shows before In a Different Light at nonprofit spaces which were proliferating in the city. These important shows, Situation, which was also curated by Nayland Blake with Pam Gregg, and also featured a catalog essay by Richard Meyer, as well as Real Tears, which curated by Glenn Helflin, which merged artifice and pop culture through mixed constructs of straight and queer sensibilities. Glenn was a very important curator of the scene and graphic designer. And this was at the Arts Commission, and both of these shows, Situation and Real Tears, both featured the work of Cary Leibowitz, a.k.a. Candy S., who was basically the New York spirit of the San Francisco scene. His joyful pathos really resonated strongly with a lot of our friends and artists. Another important show was Tiny Shoes at the New Langton Arts in 1994, curated by Daryl, poking fun at Jack Chick, Christian moralist and cartoonist, featuring a rare artist appearance by Rick Jacobson, who made a sign, "Cruise, you fools, it's getting late." So it's really hard to describe the magnanimous character and charm of Rick Jacobson. He could talk to anyone about anything. But in the early 90s, Rick was working as an outreach counselor for 18th Street Services. He was a former hustler in sobriety and HIV positive, and while having health issues that required him to have a more indoor life, he thought he needed a change. When he had to attend 2 memorials in one day, he realized that he couldn't make an impact with AIDS, but maybe he could with art. With $900 severance money in 1993, he rented out the tiniest space imaginable in the Mission on 14th Street near Guerrero. A small front room with a tiny back loft and a hallway to an even smaller back room with a giant bathtub in it. The Mission was cheap and just on the outskirts of the Castro. Most of his closest friends had reservations about this venture. The walls had thick impasto texture that was really gross. And remember, at the time, 14th Street was pretty gnarly. But Rick was undeterred. He really wanted to do it, and once he got his sights on something, he did it. It helped that next door was Red Door's Bearded Lady, a queer women's space that had a shared patio space that made it, shared patio space in the back with Kiki that made it a destination spot for queer punks in the Mission. This is Lori Hartman, Harry Dodge, and Tribate Silas Howard, who were the owners. So when Rick started his show, he opened with a bang, and a show called Kaka at Kiki. Opened in the summer of 1993. The shows ran for about 3 weeks on average. They were really quick turnaround, and they were back-to-back. He just banged them out, these shows. And who wouldn't turn out for a show about shit? It was a huge hit and put Kiki on the map. But other guiding lights of the scene were Nayland Blake, who was generous figurehead, really amazing artist and advisor and friend. His partner, the late actor and performer Philip Horvitz. Wayne Smith, a really great dear friend of mine, and Jim Winters, who had the second show and who has a lot of the Kiki stuff archived on his website. Other artists were video artists Leslie Singer and Cecilia Doherty, Vince Fecteau, genius, myself. Vince and I actually had our first show together at Kiki. Cliff Hanks, who was doing these very elegant analog primers of gay inspiration. So those were, great designers. Madonna songs, gay porn stars, all kinds of things, very elegantly written and crafted in a very lo-fi way. Of course, Rex Ray, and the artist, the skater, Mark Gonzalez, Michelle Rollman, Keith Meyerson in one of his first shows post UCI graduate work called Pinocchio the Big Fag. And then there was Jerome Kaya, who held his opening in the back and held court in the giant bathtub, so in a little bubble bath. And he had the show with Catherine Opie in the front room, which was kind of a groundbreaking show at the time, and a lot of this work was also featured in a different light. Other shows, the Bong Show, which was also an amazing group show that featured many artists. It was also co-curated by Alleged Gallery's Aaron Rose. And this is a bong by Teresa A. Smith, who was in the In a Different Light show at the very end, in the World section, I believe. Other shows were Fanta, which featured really important people in my life, Jim Schatz, who ran Sina Sina later on, and Craig Goodman. And I think that's Jason Messier, not Mercer, but I could be wrong. But that's the pop collage artist of the stars. Another show was Daryl Alvarez and Chris Johansson, one of Chris Johansson's first big shows. We later, all three of us actually showed at Jack Hanley within the next year. And then, of course, Sick Joke, which also featured works by Cary Leibowitz. Later in the run of Kiki, Rick turned to a lot of performance work, mainly a fascinating talk show with a Chicago drag queen named Jo Jet Black and her sidekick Babette. And Cliff and I performed on that show. It first was at Kiki Gallery and then moved to Josie's Juice Joint when it got too popular. But here is there's a clip of me and Cliff in our act called Matthew and Rejoice, which was an ex-gay Christian evangelical rock band. And it didn't go over very well. Folks thought we were real, a little too real. So trying to talk to people and having lots of evil stares in the audience was kind of crazy. Real quick, I just want to touch base that after Kiki did its run, ended in 1995, Jim Schatz and Darren Klein started Sina Sina shortly after. That was also a kind of a lo-fi gallery space in Jim Schatz's apartment, or below his apartment. And then there was also ESP Gallery by Matt Pulowski, and Julie Deemer's Four Walls were really important galleries that kind of rose out of the influence of Kiki at the time. And I think really kind of set the scene for the Mission School later on. So this was from a tribute show to Kiki at Ratio 3. Kevin Killian and Coulter Jacobson, who's not related to Rick, recreated a tribute show called The Proof is in the Pudding, based on a phrase that was stated by Yoko Ono in the Yoko Ono show, the last show at Kiki Gallery. And I feel like this was a show from 2008, and I feel like now people need to be reminded of Kiki's importance about every 9 years or so. The lasting legacy of Kiki is the Kiki box, which he had all the artists that showed there make a multiple, and it ran an edition of 30 boxes. And it was supposed to be done every year, but unfortunately there was only one done. So to end this with Rick, he had a really successful string of shows, but by the end, he was diagnosed with cancer. And he decided to end the space on a high note with a tribute show to Yoko Ono that he curated with Wayne Smith called Peace, 9 Artists Consider Yoko Ono. And the highest note being the answering machine from Yoko herself, acknowledging the show. And that played in the tribute show on a loop. So you could hear Yoko's voice. It was very exciting. But as part of that show, and I don't remember, Cliff, maybe you can tell me if it was at the opening or the closing, Cliff and Rex Ray did a reenactment of John Lennon and Yoko Ono's Cambridge 1969 out front in the street. And it's charged, invoked, reenactment attracted the weirdest, craziest homeless street energy and stopped traffic. Because the crowds eventually moved into the street to witness it. It was eventually shut down by the police, and that is how you go out with the show. Such tumult, such humor, such chutzpah. Kiki was a matchbox, burning too quickly but so brightly. In its brilliant wake, we lost Jerome, we lost Rick, we lost Philip, and we lost Rex. But we gained a hope, a spark that through sheer determination, wit, and will, one can make a lasting impact on others and the world. It can happen again if you want it. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So our last panelist is Margaret Tedesco, who's an artist and curator working across performance, installation, photography, sculpture, and video. She has presented and collaborated with visual and performance artists, writers, and filmmakers for more than 25 years. Her work has been shown nationally and internationally, and in 2007, Margaret established Second Floor Projects, an artist-run exhibition and publishing space in San Francisco. She grew up in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and she's in San Francisco tonight. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hello. I'm very happy to be here, and Scott made me cry a little bit at the end. It's kind of amazing to see all this work tonight, and I'm sorry, I am a little emotional on that last note, because we're all here and we're still doing it, so it's lovely. So I'll get out of this verklempt moment and begin. So first I would like to thank everyone at CJM, and especially Gravity, for this invitation. And I'd like to also thank Dina Beard at the Lab, Heather Snyder at San Francisco Camera Work, artist Rebecca Bollinger, who's here tonight, artist Zoe Kroll, who at the time was the assistant director of the lab for the conference that I'm about to describe. And to Amy Shoulder, editor of City Lights then, currently at Feminist Press, and to the late Rex Ray for his keen designs, and lastly to Laura Brune, director of the lab, who was one of the theory girls, and Marnie Gillette, director of San Francisco Camera Work, who are no longer here in body, but spirit, for their vision at the time. And to say both of these spaces provided a queer, positive, feminist atmosphere for a broad base of experimental works in the day. So my focus tonight will be on a conference that followed on the heels of In a Different Light exhibition. The conference was titled Utopia, Dystopia, the third annual conference on feminist activism and art, presented by San Francisco Camera Work in the Lab and took place at YBCA Center for the Arts Theater and SF MoMA in April 1995. So Different Light just closed, and this conference took place. And this is the third, so I will bring up, and this, when I tell you the history I'm about to tell you, this is the book cover that comes from the first conference of, that Amy Shoulder edited, and Rex Ray designed this book cover in City Lights. So for the past 3 years, this is the history of Utopia, Dystopia, Feminist Activism and Art Conference. For the past 3 years, San Francisco Camera Work and the Lab's annual conference on feminism, activism, and art has provided a forum for feminist activists and artists to address issues of shared concern, exchange ideas and information, and form new diverse community networks. The first conference, held in 1992, addressed a variety of topics centered around the female experience of violence in American culture. City Lights Books published Critical Condition, Women on the Edge of Violence, a book documenting the dialogue at the first conference. The second conference, The Illustrated Woman, focused on women's bodies, politics, and featured Parisian body artist Orlan, as well as dozens of other visual artists, performance artists, writers, video and filmmakers, activists, and theorists. And this particular conference that I'm focusing on tonight, Utopia, Dystopia, was the third one, focused on evolution of community through art rooted in social consciousness, envisioning both dystopic and ideal scenarios for the development of culture in the new millennium. Participants presented their work and discussed how they have utilized, formed, or transformed networks of communication, from zines to public access TV, from alternative art centers to the internet. So the roster of participants was hefty. So Rex also designed this poster for the lab for the conference. And we have Rachel Rosenthal, who I had the pleasure of working with in the 80s. I took her DBD experience, workshop experience. It was 72 hours in a weekend. And you literally, you didn't sleep. You just performed, and performed. And she was amazing to work with. So we had Rachel Rosenthal, who was the headliner. And then this is the cover of the program, and this is her in performance on the cover of the. So the lineup of people, of artists that were in this 3-day conference with panels and presenting work online, in public access TV, and showing their work in 2 different galleries, the Lab and San Francisco Camera Work. We had Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, Julia Sinagini, photographer, Pamela Z, Kathleen Hanna, and then a whole line of videos by many different people, and Deep Dish TV, Paper Tiger TV, and Dyke TV. And Colette Gator, visual artist, Rebecca Bollinger, who's here tonight, Sharon Grace, Erica Lopez, and it was moderated by writer Catherine Greenblatt, and who used to live here. Dee Dee Halleck was the founder of Deep Dish and Paper Tiger TV. Ada Mancias, Tony Lane, Susan Cervantes, founder and director of Presida Eyes, excuse me, Harry Dodge, and that was moderated by Dee Dee Halleck. Then we had Lesbian Cyberspace Biography, and that was with Barbara Hammer. And then Future Facts, the name of the piece that Rachel Rosenthal performed, was a meditation on the nature of time. Rachel Rosenthal receives a fax from the future, AD 2092 to be exact. Life on Earth has been profoundly altered after a colossal calamity which occurred in AD 2011. Pretty close. So the reading of this material conjures up voices and sounds of the senders and their environment. Rosenthal realizes that time may be a torus looping back upon itself. And then we had Martha Rossler at SF MoMA, with Catherine Lord, and they gave a talk called Inadequate Descriptive Systems. And then next door to the lab was another small space called Lunacy. And Lunacy was a women's performance space. And Marian Kronberg and Crystal Mason, who was very big in AIDS ACT UP, they ran that space together. And there was a performance called Mr. Backlash and one called Repetitive Strain. Access to Power, Forming Culture in the 90s. And the panel was Susan Mooney, Jocelyn Taylor, Pearl Ubungan, choreographer. Jocelyn Taylor was the co-producer of Dyke TV, video artist, and now she goes by the name Jaguar Mary. Renee Edgington, and that was moderated by Margaret Crane, who also was big in Kiki world as well. The Queen of Cyberspace was presented by Roseanne Stone. And then I'm going to show you now my slides. So we'll have a little bit of redundancy here because there was overlap, of course. Okay, so we're starting with Rebecca Bollinger. And I will say one thing that was funny. When I started doing more deeper research, I had a hand in making the Camera Work Journal in the 90s for the outcome of this conference later on. My partner and I at the time, we put this together. And so I could scan from the actual book, but I also went towards looking around and asking artists for some of their work. But one of the funniest things I found online that still exists from 1995 is in Google Docs, is a call to action by Zoe Kroll at the time, who was the assistant director, asking for all kinds of equipment, announcing the show, talking about the participants. And it was just strange to find it in the ether that it was 95 and it was threaded, so people were talking back and forth about getting the equipment. And of course, it was all these really strange, Macs that had all those odd names in the day, whatever they're called. They were called in the 90s. They don't have those names anymore. The different models of Macs. And of course, this was the dawn of the term new media. We don't usually use that term as much anymore because it's not new media any longer. But then it was, and it was really dominated by a lot of women in the day. So the images, and by the way, many of the images of documentation of the performances that became part of this journal were done by Marian Gray, who recently also passed away in the last year. So I'm going to show you, this is a cake. I'm going to show you, actually, I'm going to ask you to play the video first, and then we'll talk about the cake, so you can see. So this is the video of the machine that Rebecca used to make the icing images on the cake. So that wasn't the work that was actually in the show that she showed, but this was a different, but I just wanted to show you the machine. And the title of the work that she had in the show for the particular conference time frame of the exhibition was called, In My Humble Opinion, it's Jessie Helms. And the image is digitally constructed as icing on cake from the Series 1000 computer decorating machine. The piece, the overall, the Sugar Conclusion and Analysis is an interactive computer installation that uses digital ice cakes as a vehicle to explore layers of meaning, messaging, and consumption in the landscape of digital communication. And that was with the headlands, right? That was the one you showed at the headlands, right? Okay. So that's the cake with Jessie Helms. That's the machine. And then that's the performance that was left, the residue from the cake at the headlands. And then we have Barbara Hammer. And so these were later requested by the editors of the Journal of Camera Work to put folio pages in for each of the, like an artist page for each. So this is what Barbara Hammer did. She did this collage. And then this is Erica Lopez, excuse me. And Erica Lopez, you probably can't read, this is when pig-colored and dolphin-shaped dildos left me dry, I designed my own line of fake penises that had lives of their own. So this is a whole page of different penises. And this is a cover of her book that she did later on. And then we have Harry Dodge. Harry Dodge did amazing performance during the conference. And I'm going to also speak, and this was Harry's folio page in the journal. And then here's my image for the Red Dora's Bearded Lady Cafe, which shared the backyard with Kiki Gallery. And so Harry co-owned it, as Scott mentioned. It was on 14th and Guerrero, early 1990 it lasted almost 10 years, with Silas Howard, who was in the band Tribe 8, and later to be collaborators on the film By Hook or By Crook. And according to the internet, I didn't know this, but Kiki and Herb, as in Kiki, Justin, Vivian Bond, christened the place Red Dora's Bearded Lady Cafe. That I didn't know. And Harry just received a Guggenheim, which was really great. So, and then we have, the ad that was in the program notes for the conference. And you can see what it says. The Bearded Lady is a dyke coffee house and cabaret. Everyone is welcome. Working to, what does it say? I can't, display visual art and performance art by radical women, women of color, punks, queers, freaks, and experimental gender folks. In order to do this, they sell coffee, good veggie food, and hip promotional products. And it was really a great place to go to. I mean, you had what you described, and then you had this next door. So you couldn't go wrong on 14th Street. And then down the street, ESP Gallery also. So, and then this is the artist page for Lunacy. This was also an amazing space. I got to go there on a number of occasions. There was one group that would come up from LA. Zoe, help me. The sacred, what were they called? The Sacred Nature Girls? Do you remember? Zoe, where are you? Yeah, they were really amazing. They came up and performed a lot, and there were a lot of really amazing. And also, by the way, Zoe was also one half of a duo called the Daughters of Houdini and the Day. Pamela Z, composer. She was with George Coates early on. Lynn Hirschman from the Electronic Diaries, Kathleen Hanna. She also did an amazing talk performance at the conference. And then here's a zine page that she did for the journal as well. And then we have choreographer Pearl Ubungan, who's just moved back here. And activist Filipino-American produced street spectacles, staging works around issues such as displacement of residents from the I Hotel near Chinatown. She did a 20-year anniversary spectacle pageant where the hotel once stood. She danced with Ed Mock, the choreographer who died of AIDS, who Brontez Purnell is currently producing a documentary on. So here's some images from her work. So yeah, I just found out she just moved back here. It was really great to go through all of these artists and look them all up again and see where people were, what they're doing now. So this is the artist formerly known as Jocelyn Taylor is how she describes herself on the site, and her name now is Jaguar Mary. And at the time, she was the co-producer of Dyke TV, and she was in ACT UP. And the video that's central in black and white is called Bodily Functions, and I believe that's the one that showed in the conference. And then this is just an image, a screenshot of her current webpage with her videos. And this video right here, top right, is a really interesting video. I remembered it. I didn't remember it for the longest time, and then when I saw it again, I remembered it. It's a take on a Godard film that's in that Aria DVD with 7 directors, 7 different French directors, I believe. And it's a takeoff on that, and it's really, what she does with it is really great. And then she has a radio program that she produces called Woke Radio. And then this is another person who's no longer with us. Christine Tamblin. She taught at, I have only 3 more slides. She's a media artist. She was faculty that used to be in the department called Inner Arts at SF State, and she taught at UC Berkeley. She did CD-ROMs, which now we no longer use. This was, hello, my name is Christine, welcome to my mind, I want to interact. That's on her CD-ROM. And then here's a page from Interior CD-ROM about interacting. She was quite the woman in the day with her work. And the last person I'm going to quickly talk to you about, we're almost the last, this is Toni Lane. Toni Lane had a studio that's Hayes Valley for 17 years, and she did this series called Ghetto Girls. And I met her, and at the time my partner and I were working on a project in France collaborating with a group of women in France called Casa Factory, and they did street mural journals. And we asked Toni if she wanted to put the Ghetto Girls in the street mural journals. Well, it was like we gave her a gift of France all of a sudden. She was like waiting all her life to go to France and live there. And the minute she had a project on the street in France, she packed her bags and just went there. And she lived there the next 10 years, and we helped her get a place to live there because Isabelle was living in Marseille. So then she did the Ghetto Girls in Marseille. And there's Toni, Sharon Grace. Name of the work is Millennium Venus. She was in and then the last 2 are Paper Tiger Television. And those are their posters. And those are my slides. Thank you. Sorry, I went over a little bit.
We have a little bit of time for discussion and also for questions from the floor. I guess I just want to say this was very moving to see this history or these histories brought back. And I guess the question I have is about the difficulty of that practice, you know, as people leave and as so many artists are forgotten, spaces are forgotten, the way that art history works is extremely selective, and also historical memory is sometimes very arbitrary or exclusive. And I just, so it's great that we have this night, but one sort of wonders, like, this show in a different light was now more than 20 years ago. Kiki, a little older than that, and the conference that you talked about just at the same time as the closing, so history went both backwards and forwards a little bit tonight. But I guess I'm just wondering about, especially Scott, toward the end of your presentation, we're talking about art, but we're also talking about people who made the art, and also worlds that were created. I mean, sometimes from the smallest of material means, the way you described that gallery. And so anyway, I think that's more of a set of musings than an actual question, but I thought maybe you could share musings with us about that.
Well, it's kind of funny, in preparing this talk, I had a big list of people and lots of touch points, and it got so huge that I had to really narrow it down further and further and further. But there was so much going on in the 90s at the time, and it led to so many different things, and we had lives after this event. It's not just, like, we continued on, and, but it's very weird that so much time has passed. But Cliff and I, we've been together this whole time since about 27 years. We're in our place for 24 years, which is a rarity in the city. We've, like, a lot of time has stood still. At the same time, it's changed rapidly. And so it's a very funny feeling. A lot of the artists, a lot of our friends don't live here anymore. The scene is not as vital, I guess. There's different kinds of scenes. I don't know exactly what's even happening most of the time. But there is an amnesia. I agree that, there are new people building up, creating their own origin myths and their own scenes, and they're not looking back as much. And with the internet, there is a lot of there's a lot of information, but it's not necessarily like, oh, let's research the past. Let's go here. It's all about, like, what can I occupy my mind now? And so it's a very weird place to be. Me and Cliff have talked about survivor's guilt in a lot of ways, about not just in terms of AIDS, which is part of that, but also in terms of just being here and not being able to move, but also being okay with it and just laying low. And and I don't know. I don't have a very funny, witty anecdote to, like, leave it, but there's still some great things here, and it's just but I'm glad to at least share the time that we had.
Yeah, it is indeed strange to still be around almost 25 years later. I feel very lucky to have lived through kind of two Kiki moments, one genuine Kiki and the other ungenuine Kiki. The ungenuine one was earlier in New York City in 1983 to 87, the Gallery Nature Mort scene, a very similar kind of situation, a pinhole-sized gallery that had an inordinate impact, and also a history that's kind of sort of lost in a way. And those things can come up through the most subtle, nuanced combinations of personality, definitely not money. Neither of these places had any money to speak of, but just personality, perseverance, strength of vision, and I guess the right circumstances. So it can happen again. I, as a curator, try very, very much to stay as focused as I can on the present moment and not to get too nostalgic about the past. And so the closest thing that I know of going on today to anything like this spirit is in Oakland. There's something called the Malidoma Collective, African-American queer positive women's community that I think has something of the kind of vortex-like feeling that Kiki had, but very, very different at the same time. I mean, it is a completely different community, different historical situation. But it's exciting to me that there are people still getting together collectively to think through issues of identity and representation.
So I want to make sure, because we do have limited time, that people in the audience who have questions have lots more, but I'd rather it be somewhat democratic. So any questions? No one likes to be first, I know. There's anxiety for us all having to go first. So I'll just ask another question while you're formulating whoever's going to be first. There's one of the things we talked about in the sort of rehearsal phone call that we had was what's changed and whether queer is still as operative a term. I mean, partially it was coming out of activism, specifically Queer Nation, and that had itself come out of ACT UP. There was an urgency around the term, and one of us had brought up the way in which trans today seems to have an urgency, and actually was not a term as much. And I'm really interested in the fact drag in your show, which seems like one of the categories that isn't necessarily numerical, like it's a kind of a difference to me than some of the other categories, unless, I mean, and I don't know if it came after couple or not, but maybe drag is about two-ness.
It was sort of between self and other. It was
Okay.
about sort of putting on otherness or embodying a two-ness or something like that. Yeah.
So in addition to the internet and all of the changes in terms of community building and alternative sexuality and the ways in which people gather, and in addition to the internet, it seems like the rise, or at least the popular visibility of transgender celebrities and just a movement, legal struggles, that this is perhaps, I don't know, kind of one of the things that one would have to definitely think about if in revisiting in a different light.
Yeah, I think
across
for
25
sure. I
years.
think trans is one of the most powerful ideas to come across our culture in God knows how long. I mean, it really is it's an extension in a way of, what queerness was trying to do, but it takes it into a bodily situation, and it just messes with so many constructions and expectations and biases that it's super powerful. And it was not, that terminology was just not present, at least not to my knowledge back in the day. And I think there were moments of kind of what we now may retrospectively think of as trans experience suggested in the show, but just not identified that way.
Yeah, and that's actually interesting. I just remember myself, like Justin Vivian Bond, like when I bought books at In a Different Light would be, and I thought of him as a drag queen. I mean, I had no familiarity with the idea. And you mentioned Jocelyn Taylor, I think, and I don't know whether Jaguar Mary is about a crossing of gender or some other kind of reinvention. But it just seems like there are different formats that kinds of queer, I think, reinvention and life are taking.
Well, I think it's not like a standardization of identity
Right.
Is a part of it, and like with the group, like with Jerome and Justin and Rodney, especially, like Rodney didn't want to be addressed as she, Rodney addressed as he. So it was, there was certain, I think it was up to the person to really decide what their outward identities were going to be, I guess. And so it was hard to lump people into certain categories. And so like drag queen, it became problematic.
Yes.
In some senses, because it started, especially later on, what is drag, what's trans, and in the 90s when we were all really young and we were using these words like, because they were hurtful words and we were taking them back, like fag, dyke, queer, and we were owning them, and and kind of like a rally, battle cry against people who are oppressing us. And that was one thing, but I think it's grown to such an extent that it's still like, now it's gone back, I guess, a little bit not to use those words. I still use queer a lot just because I definitely identify as gay, I'm very cisgendered, but, I don't feel like I'm an assimilationist. Like, I don't want a house, I don't want kids, so that was also part of it, was like not wanting to be like the same as straight people, but I didn't feel like with the gay community so much. So queer really kind of spoke to me a lot more. But then there's still, like, you talked about Mike Kuchar, who, did not like that word. Yeah. And, still to this day doesn't, never like that word. So, it's really, and now I teach kids, and it's like, you have to be very careful, what you say in schools now. And so I try to be very, very deliberate and careful and open with my language. But yeah, so it's something we now have to navigate more carefully.
I see two hands. Frank?
Sure. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the codification, or if you can talk a little bit about the codification around a different light. I mean, you're talking about Kiki, you're talking about a really vibrant scene, and those of us who are often perched institutionally, there's a lot of nuance there, and a lot of ways, from the community perspective, that can be seen as like appropriating it, assimilating it. Was a different light seen at the time as a real like strike for the community, or a kind of, was there a little bit more of a skepticism because it's enshrined in Berkeley, in the university, in that great building?
Right. Well, I think this was precisely what Nayland was cautioning against, of just simply assimilating or appropriating something that was doing perfectly well without the museum, and his suggestion that the museum do something that couldn't be done elsewhere and really own its power and capabilities and bring something to the community, add something to the conversation. So that's what we tried to do. I was deeply and firmly in the museum and still am, so I can't really speak about the perspective from outside, but we were criticized by Harmony Hammond and some other folks from the lesbian community for not being kind of fully embracing or equal in our representation of male and female gay and lesbian experience. And Harmony went on to curate and kind of a response show, which was great to do. But I don't know. What do you think? You were in the community. Were people happy or not? And by the way, I want to acknowledge that Margaret, I think, in Second Floor Projects, in a way, has been a longitudinal continuation of the spirit of all of this. And if you want to sample a flavor of what this was about, you can still find it at Second Floor Projects. Was there talk about the show at the conference, for example, which was right on the heels of the exhibition?
Do you have any recollections, Zoe? I mean, can you help with that at all? I know you were in the middle of organizing, but do you remember if people were speaking about In a Different Light? I can't quite remember about the Berkeley show. I think people were excited. People were excited. People were excited.
I think you actually have the next question. Did you have your hand raised?
So I was really struck with the Different Light show and just hearing you speak about the intergenerational nature of it and kind of the more established artists and iconic artists, and then Scott, hearing you say like was your, some of these shows were your first shows, you just arrived, and with the Feminist Activism Art Conference, like Harry was a figure in the community, and I believe that was his first show performance, like in a venue, in a formal venue. And same with, and I think Kathleen Hanna had, was performing constantly, but in that kind of a context with all these other artists coming from really small community activist groups across the country. And so I felt like there was this feeling of we were all educating each other, like we were learning the sense of history and the sense of future. And so I guess I'd be interested. I don't feel a sense of that. Like now I feel like there's like only the future. We only talk about the future and the present, and there's a little bit of nostalgia. But I guess I'd like to hear from you all about moments, what you think of that, and are there moments now where we can connect those dots and kind of keep the past, present, future alive?
I do, having the space that I have, twice a semester I get, a class from, let's say, CCA and one from SFAI that visit a show. And many of my shows are cross-generational, and not, but many have been. And we talk together when they come, and a lot of times it can be a curatorial show, a curatorial class that will come. Like, for instance, I just had Jordan Stein's class come. And people like Jordan, and also when Rennie was teaching at CCA, I think we're keeping the spirit of a lot of this alive in the conversations. And, you know, and I'm seeing that there are the students coming through, and they do want to know about what happened and how, and they're incorporating it, or they're seeking out the legacies of these things and wanting to incorporate them somehow into something new that they're doing. So there's some part of it that's happening. It's kind of small, but it's happening, and it's exciting, and it's always exciting to tell the story. I mean, I'm not looking, I mean, I was, you know, moved up here, but I'm not nostalgic for it all to be again. I'm just, it's just like noticing the impact of what we did and how we do it and how we keep doing it, because these things are still happening in these ways. I mean, you know, so anyway, I won't drag on about it, but yeah.
I mean, I think there's like artists that that are addressing, you know, some of the things in the past, but also still current, like Josh Fott and Coulter Jacobson and Gwinnell Racky, who are, you know, doing, you know, interesting, you know, who've been around for a long time, but also still are, you know, moving forward with their work and showing it in new places. And I think that's a lot of it. Is like San Francisco is such a really microscopic scene in some ways that it's hard to get out of. But I don't know, I have, you know, it's hard with the economy the way it is and the struggles that people have. I think, you know, I think it's gonna, hopefully there will be some artists that, you know, pull through and make their own, you know, scenes. It's always been like a pocket of clusters of different scenes, different galleries, different artists. Kiki was by far not the only scene. I mean, there was Epicenter, there was Clubstitute, there was all these people doing other things, there was lots of stuff going in South of Market. You know, all sorts of things were happening in the city, and a lot of people don't get out of their neighborhoods. They, you know, they stay in their neighborhoods. Like me, I barely leave the Mission. So, you know, I'm a big fault of that. But, you know, I think, I think there is, you know, I'm hoping that there is, with the new, a lot of with stuff with the Oakland, there's, you know, thriving scenes going on there. I think there's stuff will happen again. So we'll have to see.
And I'll just mention one other crossover I think that's really exciting and important is I think that, you know, Kevin Killian, in his way of being at the school at CCA and, you know, having his relationship with the writer, the students that are the writing, you know, taking a degree in writing, he's helping them cross over into the visual art. I mean, he's bringing people from various, you know, spaces and and then there's Right Window that's been around also for 10 years. I've been around for 10 years. Right Window has been is this collective and is a lot of crossover between the writing communities and the visual art communities and Poets Theater, which we'll have one here. And, you know, all of these things, I think, keep things thriving and bringing different, you know, 20-year-olds in with the 50-year-olds, and, you know, the generations are crossing over, so, yeah.
And I just, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I just wanted to say by way of thank you to the panelists and also to the museum, you know, I think that it's telling that this conversation happened on the occasion or because there's this Cary Leibowitz show here at a museum. And I think sometimes we overlook the way in which art can help us remember, or art, and often it's the role of the museum to provide the occasion for people to look at things that aren't necessarily, I mean, the art here is contemporary, but thinking about the history, say, of Cary Leibowitz's work and a history of queer sensibility in San Francisco and New York and other places. And I think that museums, you know, it seems to me really brilliant, actually, that Nayland, as an artist, would say to you, Larry, then a curator at the Berkeley Art Museum, the museum needs to use the money it has, the resources it has, to go beyond just trying to capture the contemporary, because actually that's its own thing, but to contextualize it and to see a Romaine Brooks, to see Kathy Opie next to her, or, you know, and then look at Romaine Brooks, or to see Deb Cass with actual Makos photographs of Warhol or Warhol himself. I think that these are there's a way in which we should look also to art as a kind of living history. And I think, and also as ways to think queerly kind of against the narratives that we've been given of what matters in terms of art. And to me, that's what tonight has provided, is just these other ways of thinking about this past. I actually lived in, I wrote for that situation. I never went to Kiki. I never knew about it. I saw Jerome, at the end of some, but anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is you could even live through the history and be like ignorant or like clueless, as maybe is the better word. And I was queer, or I thought I was queer, or gay. I don't know. I thought, I was having sex, but I wasn't. So I think that moments like this, and that they're institutionally supported, can provide like a ways back, and also for people like my students who never could have lived it because they just weren't old enough yet. So I wanted to say that by way of thanking the Contemporary Jewish Museum and the panelists and the audience for coming.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.